One of the most unusual military campaigns in human history unfolded in the lifeless expanses of the Arctic. While the main armies fought on the fields of Europe, small groups of Soviet meteorologists waged their secret war against the German Wehrmacht. Their weapons were not tanks and planes, but radio transmitters and meteorological instruments. But the success of the entire war depended on their work. Every weather report they transmitted saved the lives of thousands of people, and every accurate forecast brought victory closer. This war was fought in conditions where the temperature dropped to -50 degrees, where the polar night lasted for months, and where a mistake meant not just defeat, but death from the cold. The history of this secret war remained unknown for a long time. But today, we will open its pages and learn about the heroism of the people who fought the enemy at the very edge of the earth. Subscribe to our channel to learn more. Amazing stories about little-known episodes of the Great Patriotic War. What do you think? Could modern technology completely replace the courage and self-sacrifice of those polar explorers? Or does the human factor still remain decisive in extreme conditions? Share your opinion in the comments. When we talk about the Great Patriotic War, we most often remember the battles of Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk. But there was another front, invisible, harsh, where every day decided the fate not only of individual battles, but of the entire war. This front stretched across the endless expanses of the Arctic, where Soviet meteorologists waged their secret war against the German Wehrmacht. The Arctic sea routes were of strategic importance that cannot be overestimated. The Northern Sea Route connected the European part of the Soviet Union with the Far East, allowing the transfer of troops, equipment, and strategic raw materials. Caravans traveled this route carrying nickel from Norilsk, which was necessary for the production of armor, timber from the Siberian taiga for the construction of fortifications, and food for the besieged Leningrad. But it was not only its transport significance that made the Arctic important. Whoever controlled the Arctic weather stations gained an information advantage that could change the course of the war. Weather forecasts were critical for planning military operations. The success of bombing raids, the safety of convoys, and the effectiveness of artillery fire depended on the accuracy of weather reports. The German command understood this perfectly well. Already in the first months of the war, German submarines began hunting not only for transport ships, but also for polar stations. Special sabotage groups were landed on Arctic islands with the task of destroying Soviet weather stations and setting up their own. The history of this war began long before June 22, 1941. Back in the 1930s, the Soviet Union was actively developing a network of polar stations, understanding their strategic importance. Heroic winterers explored the most remote corners of the Arctic, unaware that they would soon become soldiers on an invisible front. The first radio message about the approach of German ships was received from the polar station on Dixon Island on August 3, 1942. Station Chief Nikolai Kornyakov broadcast a short message. "I see smoke on the horizon. Presumably military ships. Call signs unknown." This radiogram was the signal for the start of one of the most unusual campaigns of the Great Patriotic War. Soviet polar explorers found themselves in a unique position. Formally, they remained civilian specialists, meteorologists, radio operators, mechanics, but in fact, they became special-purpose military personnel. Their weapons were not automatic rifles and machine guns, but radio transmitters and meteorological instruments. But how can you measure the value of information that can save thousands of lives? The German command developed several operations aimed at capturing or destroying Soviet polar stations. The most ambitious was Operation Wonderland, an attempt to break through the Northern Sea route with the heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer. The Germans planned not only to strike a blow against Soviet shipping, but also to capture key weather stations. The polar explorers were aided in their struggle against a well-armed enemy not only by their courage and professionalism, but also by the Arctic itself. The harsh climate, polar night, storms, and ice became allies of the Soviet meteorologists. Their knowledge of local conditions gave them an invaluable advantage over enemy paratroopers. Communication between polar stations and the mainland was maintained using a complex system of radio networks. Each station had its own call sign, broadcast schedule, and information coding system. Weather reports were transmitted in encrypted form so that the enemy could not use the weather data for their military plans. But the war in the Arctic was special, not only because of the climatic conditions. Here, every person counted, and the loss of even one specialist could lead to catastrophic consequences. Many stations were staffed by teams of 3 to 5 people who had to provide round-the-clock duty, repair equipment, stockpile fuel, and protect the station from possible saboteurs. Women polar explorers played a special role in this war. Radio operators transmitted vital reports, medics saved the wounded, and cooks ensured the survival of teams in extreme conditions. History has preserved the names of many heroines of the Arctic War, whose exploits long remained in the shadow of more famous military operations. The history of Soviet polar stations began with an ambitious project to develop the Arctic in the 1930s. The Soviet Union's leadership understood that control over northern sea routes would be a key factor in future geopolitical conflicts. The creation of a network of meteorological stations was part of a grand strategy to turn the Arctic into a Soviet stronghold. The first Soviet polar station was founded on Dixon Island in 1909 during the Tsarist era. However, the project only gained momentum after the revolution. In the 1930s, scientific outposts began to appear along the Arctic coast, each representing a small oasis of civilization amid the endless ice. Rudolph Island, Cape Desire on Novaya Zemlya, Wrangel Island, Tixi Bay. These names became known far beyond the Arctic Circle, thanks to the heroic work of Soviet winterers. But who could have imagined that in a few years, these peaceful scientific stations would turn into strategic military facilities? The organization of polar stations was handled by the main directorate of the Northern Sea Route under the leadership of Otto Julievich Schmidt. This outstanding scientist and organizer understood that the exploration of the Arctic required not only a scientific approach, but also military thinking. Each station had to be autonomous, capable of surviving in conditions of complete isolation. A typical polar station of the 1930s was a complex of wooden buildings connected by passageways to protect against blizzards. A residential building, a radio room, a weather station, warehouses, a power station, and a bathhouse. All this was necessary for the life and work of a team of 10 to 15 people. Special attention was paid to radio communication. Antennas and radio stations were the heart of every polar post. Personnel for work in the Arctic were selected according to the strictest criteria. Not only professional knowledge was required, but also physical endurance, psychological stability, and the ability to work in a team in conditions of isolation. Many future heroes of the Arctic War had already gone through this school of survival in peacetime. Meteorological observations at polar stations were carried out around the clock, regardless of weather conditions. Every 3 hours, specialists went out to the weather station to take readings from the instruments. Air temperature, humidity, pressure, wind direction and speed, cloud cover, visibility. All this was carefully recorded and transmitted by radio to the center. The drifting station's North Pole played a special role. The first such station, led by Ivan Dmitrievich Papanin, was set up on the ice near the pole on May 21, 1937. 4 polar explorers drifted on an ice floe for 274 days, conducting unique scientific observations. Could these brave explorers have imagined that their scientific feat would become the basis for the creation of a system that would help win the greatest war in human history? The experience of drifting stations proved invaluable when it became necessary to organize covert surveillance of the enemy in Arctic waters. Radio communication between polar stations was carried out according to a strictly established schedule. Each station had specific hours for transmitting weather reports and communicating with the center. This made it possible not only to coordinate the work of the entire network, but also to quickly detect the disappearance of any station from the airwaves. Supplying the polar stations was a real art of logistics. Once a year, during the short Arctic summer, convoys of ships delivered everything necessary for the annual wintering to the stations: food, fuel, spare parts, medicines, and mail. Any mistake in the calculations could cost the lives of the entire station crew. Food warehouses were built with a 2 to 3 year supply. Canned food, flour, cereals, sugar, and tea were all stored in special rooms protected from moisture and rodents. Special attention was paid to vitamin-enriched foods to prevent scurvy, the main danger of polar life. Medical care at polar stations also required a special approach. Each station had a first aid kit with a set of necessary medicines, surgical instruments, and bandages. Many polar explorers received medical training so that they could help their comrades in an emergency. Cultural life at the stations was no less important than material support. Libraries, radios, musical instruments, and board games helped to brighten up the long polar night. Many polar explorers kept diaries, wrote poetry, and created amateur newspapers. By the beginning of the war, there were more than 50 polar stations of various types operating in the Arctic. This network covered the entire Arctic coast of the Soviet Union and the adjacent islands. No one knew then that this peaceful scientific infrastructure would soon become a crucial element of the country's defense. Polar explorers were preparing to study the nature of the Arctic, but instead had to defend it from the enemy. On June 22, 1941, war came to the Arctic. At 4 a.m. Moscow time, Nikolai Kornikov, head of the polar station on Dixon Island, received a government message about Germany's attack on the Soviet Union. From that moment on, peaceful meteorologists became special-purpose military personnel. From the first days of the war, the German command paid special attention to the Arctic theater of operations. In the Wehrmacht's plans, the Arctic was considered a strategically important region, control of which would allow them to disrupt the USSR's maritime communications and deprive the Soviet fleet of the ability to maneuver between seas. As early as July 1941, German submarines began to appear in Arctic waters. The first reports of unknown submarines came from polar stations on Novaya Zemlya and the Svalbard archipelago. But who could have imagined that these reports would soon become part of a grand battle for information superiority in the Arctic? The Soviet command quickly realized the strategic importance of polar stations in the new conditions. Already in August, a secret order was issued to transfer all polar stations to martial law. Meteorologists were given weapons, radio operators were given new codes, and doctors received military medical training. The first attempt by German troops to capture a Soviet polar station was made on Medveji Island in the Barents Sea. On August 27, 1941, the German submarine U-711 landed a group of saboteurs with the task of destroying the radio station and meteorological equipment. The polar station team on Medveji Island consisted of only 6 people led by station chief Mikhail Babushkin. When radio operator Pyotr Skibnev discovered traces of unknown people landing in the morning, the polar explorers realized that the war had reached their remote post. The short battle lasted about an hour. The German saboteurs had a significant advantage in weapons and numbers, but the Soviet polar explorers knew every rock on their island. Using cover and their knowledge of the terrain, the defenders of the station were able to repel the first attack and send a radio message about the attack. This radiogram became the first report from the Arctic front of the Great Patriotic War. Medveji Station has been attacked by unknown persons. We are fighting. We require assistance. These short phrases, transmitted in Morse code, heralded the beginning of a new chapter in the war. Reinforcements arrived only 3 days later. The Soviet minesweeper T-116 landed a group of Marines on the island, but it was too late. The polar station lay in ruins, the radio equipment was destroyed, and the meteorological instruments were broken. Of the 6 defenders, only radio operator Skibnev remained alive, seriously wounded but managing to hide in the rocks. The events on Medveji Island showed the German command that capturing the polar stations would be a more difficult task than originally expected. The Soviet polar explorers were ready to fight to the last, defending their posts like fortresses. In September 1941, an attempt was made to organize the defense of the most important polar stations. Groups of military specialists, signalmen, artillerymen, and sappers were sent to the large stations, but most of the small stations remained virtually defenseless. The Northern Fleet, under the command of Admiral Arseny Golovko, played a special role in the defense of the Arctic. The fleet's ships patrolled Arctic waters, covered polar stations, and delivered reinforcements and supplies. But there were catastrophically few forces to defend the vast water area. German submarines were becoming increasingly bold. In October, U-601 sank the Soviet icebreaker Malagin near Novaya Zemlya. In November, U-134 fired on the polar station at Cape Jelanya, forcing the polar explorers to abandon their posts and take shelter in underground bunkers. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was a time of serious trials for the polar explorers. Many stations lost contact with the mainland due to damage to their antennas during the shelling. Supplies were disrupted, and medical assistance was unavailable. But could people who had spent years learning to survive in the harshest conditions on the planet really give up? Polar explorers developed their own tactics for waging war in Arctic conditions. Spare radio stations were hidden in secret locations, false antennas were installed to mislead the enemy, and underground shelters with autonomous life support systems were created. By the spring of 1942, it became clear that the war in the Arctic was becoming protracted. The Germans were unable to quickly capture or destroy the Soviet polar stations, but the Soviet side did not have sufficient forces to reliably defend all posts. In the summer of 1942, The German command decided to conduct a large-scale operation in the Arctic under the code name Wonderland. The goal of the operation was to strike Soviet shipping in the Kara Sea and capture key polar stations that provided meteorological information to the Northern Fleet. The heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer, commanded by Captain Zurzee Wilhelm Meyendorff Pufendorf, was assigned to carry out the operation. This ship, with a displacement of 14,000 tons, was armed with 6 273mm guns and capable of speeds up to 28 knots. On August 16, 1942, the Admiral Scheer left the Norwegian port of Kirkenes and set course for the east. The cruiser was accompanied by 4 destroyers and a group of submarines. But did the German command know that every movement of their squadron was being tracked from Soviet Arctic polar stations? The first reports of the German squadron's appearance came from the polar station at Cape Desire on August 20th. The station chief, Ivan Papanin, not the famous polar explorer, but his namesake, reported by radio, "I observe smoke from 4 ships heading northeast. I assume they are military ships." The information was immediately forwarded to the Northern Fleet Command, and then to Moscow. But the Admiral Scheer was moving at high speed, using fog and difficult weather conditions for camouflage. The German plan was to launch a surprise attack on Soviet targets before any countermeasures could be organized. On August 25th, the cruiser reached the Kara Sea and began hunting for Soviet ships. The first victim was the icebreaker Alexander Sibiryakov, which was sailing along the Northern Sea route. It was an unequal battle, a merchant ship against a heavy cruiser. The captain of the Alexander Sibiryakov, Anatoly Kacharava, ordered the radio operator to send a message about the appearance of the German cruiser, while he himself led the ship into attack. The heroic crew fought to the last shell, but the forces were incomparable. The steamer sank, but managed to transmit the enemy's coordinates. This radiogram became a signal to mobilize all forces in the Soviet Arctic. Polar stations went on high alert, radio operators kept round-the-clock watch, and meteorologists prepared special reports for the military command. Having received information about the location of the German squadron, the Northern Fleet Command organized the defense of key facilities. Particular attention was paid to Dixon Island, where one of the largest polar stations and a radio center coordinating the work of the entire Arctic network were located. On August 27, 1942, the Admiral Scheer approached Dixon Island. The island was home not only to a polar station, but also to a small port, supply depots, and an airfield. The Germans planned to capture the island and use it as a base for further operations in the Arctic. The defense of the island was organized by the head of the polar station, Nikolai Kornikov, and the military commander of the island, Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Moshensky. They had only 40 men at their disposal: polar explorers, sailors, pilots, and workers. The artillery consisted of 2 old coastal guns and several anti-tank guns. The battle for Dixon Island began at 6 in the morning and lasted 5 hours. The German cruiser fired hundreds of large-caliber shells at the small island. The polar station was reduced to ruins, but radio communication continued. Radio operator Mikhail Kremlev transmitted reports on the progress of the battle directly from the burning radio room. The Soviet defenders of the island managed to land several hits on the German cruiser. One of the coastal guns, commanded by Senior Petty Officer Ilya Kacharava, brother of the late captain of the Alexander Sibiryakov, damaged the bow superstructure of the Admiral Scheer. This came as a complete surprise to the German command. Could the captain of the German cruiser have imagined that a small Arctic station would put up such fierce resistance? Planning an easy stroll through the Soviet Arctic, the Germans encountered fierce resistance from people who were ready to die, but not to surrender their post. Realizing that it would not be possible to capture the island quickly, and with Soviet submarines approaching, the captain of the Admiral Scheer ordered the attack to be called off and the ship to head west. Operation Wonderland had effectively failed in its first few days. Instead of destroying Soviet communications, the Germans encountered fierce resistance and suffered losses. The defense of Dixon Island became a symbol of the courage of Soviet polar explorers. A small group of meteorologists and sailors managed to stop a powerful German cruiser, proving that in the Arctic, every person and every post is of strategic importance. After the battle for Dixon Island, the nature of the war in the Arctic changed dramatically. It became clear that polar stations were not just scientific facilities, but strategic outposts ready to fight to the last. The heroism of the polar explorers became legendary, but the price of that heroism was extremely high. On Dixon Island, only 19 of the 40 defenders survived. Radio operator Mikhail Kremlev was seriously wounded, but continued to transmit reports even after a direct hit on the radio room. Station Chief Nikolai Kornikov was concussed, but did not leave his post until the end of the battle. But can the true value of their feat be measured only by the number of attacks repelled? The defense of Dixon showed the whole world that the Soviet people were ready to defend every inch of their native land, even if it was a piece of ice in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. The feat of the polar explorers did not go unnoticed in Moscow. By decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR on October 23, 1942, many defenders of the island were awarded orders and medals. Mikhail Kremlev received the Order of the Red Banner, Nikolai Kornikov, the Order of the Patriotic War, First Class. After the events at Dixon, all polar stations were placed on military alert. Self-defense groups were formed, fortifications were built, and stocks of weapons and ammunition were created. Peaceful meteorologists learned to shoot automatic weapons and throw grenades. The polar explorers at the Rouge Bay Station on Novaya Zemlya distinguished themselves in particular. When, in September 1942, the German submarine U-456 landed a sabotage group, the station's staff, led by their chief Vasily Kalyanov, met the enemy with fire from all types of weapons. The battle lasted 3 days. The German saboteurs tried to capture the radio station and destroy the meteorological equipment, but the polar explorers organized a circular defense. The women polar explorers brought ammunition and bandaged the wounded, while the men repelled the enemy's attacks. Radio operator Zinaida Portnova, not the Partisan heroine, but her namesake, continued to transmit weather reports even during the firefight. Her workplace was in the basement of the main station building, but she could only make contact by climbing up to the antenna on the roof. Each communication session was deadly dangerous. Can you imagine the strength of spirit of a woman who climbs onto the roof under enemy fire to transmit a weather report? But it was people like her who kept the entire Arctic defense system running, risking their lives to fulfill their duty. On the third day of the battle, the German saboteurs retreated to the shore, where a submarine was waiting for them. The Rouge Bay Station survived, but half of its staff were wounded or concussed. Vasily Kalyanov suffered shrapnel wounds to the head, but refused to be evacuated, continuing to manage the station's work. The polar explorers at Cape Chelyuskin acted heroically. When the station was attacked from the air by German bombers in October 1942, meteorologist Pyotr Shirshov, a namesake of the famous explorer, managed to save unique instruments by carrying them out of the burning building under bombardment. The station was destroyed, but a week later, Shirshov resumed his observations using homemade instruments. He transmitted weather reports from a tent set up on the ruins of the station. When German planes reappeared over the Cape, Shirshov hid the radio station in a crevice in the rocks and continued his work. On Wrangel Island, the polar station team led by Georgy Ushakov, not the famous Arctic explorer, but his namesake, fought heroically. When a German ship attempted to land troops, the polar explorers mined the coastline and met the enemy with organized fire. The Germans were unable to gain a foothold on the shore and retreated, losing several men killed. Ushakov was wounded in the shoulder, but continued to command the defense. The station's radio operator, Alexander Popov, transmitted the coordinates of the German ship, which allowed the Soviet Air Force to strike it. Isn't it amazing that people who devoted their lives to studying nature turned out to be such skilled warriors? The harsh school of the Arctic tempered their characters, taught them to survive in extreme conditions and make quick decisions in critical situations. Women played a special role in the heroic defense of the polar stations. Radio operators, meteorologists, nurses, cooks. They shared all the hardships of war in the Arctic with their male colleagues. Many of them died at their posts, but their names will forever remain in the history of the Arctic War. Anna Molchanova, a nurse at the polar station on Kolguyev Island, single-handedly defended the medical center from German saboteurs, armed only with a revolver and medical instruments. When the Germans broke into the building, she blew up the medicine warehouse, preferring death to captivity. The transmission of meteorological data in wartime required a special coding and encryption system. Weather information was so important that the enemy made every effort to intercept and decipher it. Soviet polar stations developed a complex system of secret codes that ensured the security of communications. The basis of the coding system was a book of ciphers, which changed every month. Each polar station received new codes via special couriers or by radio using the previous encryption system. But who could have imagined that simple temperature and pressure readings would become a state secret? Meteorological reports were transmitted at strictly defined times according to a predetermined schedule. Each station had its own call sign and operating frequency. For example, the station on Dixon Island operated with the call sign RBM, the station at Cape Desire, RBD, and the station on Novaya Zemlya, RBN. The data was encoded using a special table where each meteorological parameter was designated by a group of numbers: air temperature, atmospheric pressure, humidity, wind speed, cloud cover, visibility. All of this was converted into digital codes that were incomprehensible to the uninitiated. But simple coding was not enough. Additional measures were used to increase secrecy. False data was included in reports to confuse the enemy, transmission frequencies were changed, and stations operated under false call signs. Radio operators had to be not only communicators, but also intelligence agents. Control radio stations played a special role, listening to the airwaves and analyzing German radio transmissions. Many polar stations had receivers tuned to enemy frequencies. This allowed them not only to monitor enemy activity, but also to study their methods of operation. Ivan Cherevichny, head of the radio service at the Arctic stations, developed a system of roving radio stations. The transmitters periodically changed their call signs and frequencies. creating the illusion that there were more stations than there actually were. This made it difficult for the Germans to determine the true number and location of Soviet posts. Wasn't it genius to turn the airwaves into a battlefield, where every radio message was a shot and every call sign was a military ruse? The invisible war on the airwaves was no less important than the battles on land and at sea. German radio intelligence services made enormous efforts to decipher Soviet weather codes. To do this, they used the most modern technical means and the best cryptographers. In the captured territories, the Germans set up special radio interception centers. There were failures in the secret communication system. In November 1942, the Germans managed to decipher some of the weather codes using documents captured during a raid on the polar station at Cape Kanin-Nose. For 2 weeks, the enemy received reliable information about the weather in the Soviet Arctic. The breach was quickly discovered thanks to the vigilance of radio operators. Analysis of German radio transmissions showed that the enemy was predicting weather changes in certain areas with too much accuracy. The entire coding system was urgently changed, and those responsible for the information leak were brought before a military tribunal. To increase the reliability of communications, backup radio stations were created that operated only in emergencies. They were installed in secret locations, caves, underground bunkers, and camouflaged shelters. Often, only 2 or 3 people knew about the existence of such stations. Elena Rybakova, a radio operator at the Cape Sturligov Polar Station, created a unique system for transmitting messages using Morse code, disguised as natural radio interference. Her transmissions were so similar to atmospheric discharges that German radio intelligence officers were unable to identify the source of the information for a long time. Can we estimate the contribution of this young woman to the victory, if her interference saved dozens of ships from German submarines? The history of war is full of examples of how the personal ingenuity and courage of individuals changed the course of battles. The emergency communication system provided for the transmission of alarm signals in the event of an attack on the station. Special codes reported the approach of the enemy, the landing of troops, and the shelling of the station. These signals had the highest priority and were transmitted to all stations in the network. Call signs and frequencies of civilian radio stations were used to mask military radio transmissions. For a long time, the Germans could not understand why the radio station of a geological expedition was transmitting such detailed weather reports, and why a radio amateur from Novaya Zemlya was on the air so regularly. In 1943, a system of automatic radio buoys was introduced, which were installed on drifting ice floes and transmitted coded information about the ice situation. These buoys operated autonomously for several months, constantly changing their coordinates and providing reconnaissance in the most inaccessible areas of the Arctic. The battle for Dixon Island was a turning point in the Arctic War, but it was not the only major battle in the region. The small island, only a few square kilometers in size, acquired strategic importance comparable to that of large cities on the main fronts of the war. After an unsuccessful attack in August 1942, the Germans did not abandon their plans to capture the island. In October, the German command developed a new operation codenamed Dornröschen, Sleeping Beauty. The plan called for a special landing force to be deployed from submarines and capture the island from within. German intelligence carefully studied Dixon Island's defenses. Agents sent under the guise of polar explorers transmitted detailed information about the location of fortifications, the number of defenders, and the garrison's weapons. But could they have predicted that every inhabitant of the island was ready to become its defender? On October 27, 1942, submarine U-625 secretly approached Dixon Island from the north and landed a group of 12 saboteurs under the command of Oberleutnant Kurt Walter. The group's task was to capture the radio center and ensure the landing of the main landing force. The landing went unnoticed thanks to stormy weather and the polar night. The German saboteurs were equipped with special Arctic gear and had detailed maps of the island. They moved towards the center of the island, avoiding guard posts. The enemy was first spotted by Kayur Nikolai Amosov, who went out to check on the dog sled. Seeing the tracks of strangers in the snow, he immediately raised the alarm. Could a simple Kayur have imagined that his vigilance would save the most important Arctic defense facility? The garrison commander, Senior Lieutenant Moshensky, quickly organized the defense. All the inhabitants of the island, including women and teenagers, were given weapons and took up pre-prepared positions. The radio center was placed under special guard, and the most important equipment was prepared for evacuation or destruction. The battle began at dawn on October 28th. German saboteurs attempted to capture the radio center with a surprise attack, but encountered organized resistance. Machine gun fire and grenade explosions broke the Arctic silence. Radio operator Zoya Akulichna distinguished herself in this battle. When the Germans broke into the radio center building, she barricaded herself in the radio room and continued to transmit reports on the progress of the battle. Her last radio message was, "The Germans are in the building. I am destroying the equipment. Farewell, Motherland." The explosion of the radio room was heard throughout the island. Zoya blew herself up along with the radio station to prevent the enemy from capturing the secret equipment. Her feat became a symbol of the self-sacrifice of Soviet radio operators, who were ready to die rather than reveal military secrets. The loss of the radio center was a heavy blow, but not a fatal one. There was a spare radio station on the island, which was immediately put into operation. Communication with the mainland was not interrupted, and the Northern Fleet Command received information about the course of the battle in real time. German saboteurs captured the central part of the island, but were unable to suppress pockets of resistance on the periphery. The defenders of the island organized a circular defense, using every building as a fortress. Particularly fierce battles were fought for the weather station and supply depots. Could the German paratroopers have imagined that they would encounter such stubborn resistance from people for whom this piece of Arctic land had become their home? The polar explorers were fighting not only for a military facility, but also for the place where they had spent the best years of their lives. The battle for Dixon Island lasted 3 days. The Germans made several attempts to capture the airfield in order to land reinforcements, but each time they encountered fierce resistance. The pilots and technicians defended their airfield as if it were their own personal property. The turning point came with the arrival of reinforcements from the mainland. Despite stormy weather, 2 Soviet torpedo boats broke through to the island and landed a group of Marines under the command of Captain Fyodor Voronin. Now the forces were more evenly matched. Through the joint efforts of the polar explorers and Marines, the German group was blocked in the central part of the island. An attempt to evacuate by submarine failed. U-625 was detected by Soviet ships and damaged by depth charges. By the morning of November 1st, the resistance of the German saboteurs had been broken. Of the 12 who landed on the island, only 4 survived and surrendered. Oberleutnant Walter was fatally wounded while attempting to break through to the shore. The second battle for Dixon Island ended in a complete victory for the Soviet defenders, but the price of this victory was high. 17 people were killed, including the heroic radio operator Zoya Akulinichna. Many buildings on the island were destroyed, and the radio center required complete restoration. The captured German documents contained valuable information about the enemy's plans in the Arctic. It became known that the German command was preparing a large-scale operation to capture all key polar stations using specially trained Arctic units. Can you imagine what would have happened to the defense of the USSR if the Germans had managed to capture the entire network of Arctic weather stations? The loss of weather information would have paralyzed the actions of the Northern Fleet and aviation, making operations in the northern seas impossible. After the November battles, Dixon Island was turned into a real fortress. Long-term fortifications were built, underground warehouses were created, and additional artillery batteries were installed. The island's garrison was increased to 100 men. Particular attention was paid to air defense. German aircraft regularly raided the island, attempting to disable radio equipment and the airfield. The island's anti-aircraft gunners shot down 7 German aircraft during the winter of 1942 to 1943. It took 3 months to restore the radio center. New equipment was delivered from the mainland by dog sleds and aircraft. Communications engineer Mikhail Somov created a unique system for duplicating all the most important radio circuits, eliminating the possibility of a complete loss of communication. In the winter of 1943, the Germans made their last attempt to capture the island. Operation Polar Bear involved a simultaneous attack from the air, sea, and under the ice. But Soviet intelligence uncovered the preparations for the operation, and the attack was repelled. Thus ended the battle for the small Arctic island, which became a symbol of the unshakable Soviet defense. Dixon's held out, and with it, the entire Arctic communication system, vital to victory in the war. Submarine warfare in Arctic waters began almost simultaneously with Germany's attack on the USSR. Already in July 1941, German submarines appeared in the Barents Sea, beginning their hunt for Soviet transports and warships. But the Arctic turned out to be a very special theater of submarine operations. The German Navy Command assigned a special group of submarines under the overall command of Rear Admiral Karl Dönitz for operations in the Arctic. The group consisted of 20 Type 7 and 9 submarines specially adapted for operations in icy conditions. Arctic conditions created particular difficulties for submariners. Low temperatures caused icing on periscopes and antennas, magnetic anomalies made navigation difficult, and drifting ice posed a constant threat to surfaced boats. But could these obstacles stop experienced German submariners, accustomed to operating in all conditions? The first victim of German submarines in the Arctic was the Soviet transport ship Belostrov, sunk by U-451 on August 5, 1941, in the Novaya Zemlya area. The ship was carrying a cargo of nickel from Norilsk, and its loss was a serious blow to the defense industry. The Soviet command quickly realized the scale of the threat. Convoys in Arctic waters received increased protection, special anti-submarine groups were created, and cooperation with coastal-based aviation was established. But there were catastrophically insufficient forces to defend the vast water area. Polar stations played a special role in the fight against German submarines. Observers at coastal posts were often the first to spot submarines surfacing and relayed the information by radio. Many German boats were sunk thanks to reports from polar stations. Ivan Sadov, head of the polar station at Cape Kanin-Nos, developed a unique system for observing submarines. Using a network of observation posts and acoustic devices, He was able to track the movement of submarines in coastal waters and warn Soviet ships of the danger in a timely manner. Who would have thought that a meteorologist would become one of the most effective submarine hunters? Sedov personally participated in the destruction of 3 German submarines, coordinating the actions of the Soviet Air Force and Navy from a coastal observation post. The submarine U-362, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Heinz Franke, specialized in attacks on polar stations. In September 1942, it landed saboteurs on Dixon Island, attacked the station at Cape Jelania in October, and shelled the station on Wehrmacht Island in November. Franke was considered one of the best German submarine aces, but the Arctic conditions proved fatal for him. On December 23, 1942, U-362 was caught in an ice trap off the coast of Novaya Zemlya and was forced to surface. The submarine was immediately spotted by observers at the Malya Karmakuli polar station. The station's chief, Pyotr Kuznetsov, organized an attack on the helpless submarine with his team. The polar explorers were armed only with hunting rifles and homemade grenades, but they acted with desperate bravery. The battle on the ice lasted several hours. The crew of U-362 tried to fight off the polar explorers using deck weapons, but the advantage was on the side of the Soviet defenders, who knew every ice flow in the area around the station. As a result, the submarine was captured and its crew taken prisoner. The captured documents contained valuable information about the plans of the German submarine fleet in the Arctic. The existence of secret supply bases for German submarines on remote islands, a radio navigation system, and new types of torpedoes adapted for Arctic conditions became known. Could the German ace have imagined that his career would end in battle with a group of polar explorers armed with hunting rifles? The history of war is full of examples of how professional soldiers were defeated by ordinary people defending their homeland. A particularly fierce submarine war unfolded in the Novaya Zemlya area. This was where the most important maritime communications linking the European part of the USSR with the ports of Siberia passed. Losing control of this area would mean disrupting the entire Northern Sea route. The commander of the Soviet Submarine Division, Captain First Rank Nikolai Lunin, developed a tactic of underwater guerrilla warfare. His boats operated from hidden bases on the islands, suddenly attacking German submarines and quickly disappearing among the ice. Lunin personally sank 2 German submarines and damaged several enemy ships. His tactics were studied in all Allied submarine schools. Particularly effective was the attack from under the ice field, when the Soviet boat used the ice as natural camouflage. In March 1943, a famous battle took place between the Soviet submarine S-102, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Belyaev, and the German U-255. The opponents spotted each other simultaneously and opened fire with torpedoes at close range. Both ships were damaged, but the Soviet submarine managed to surface and finish off the enemy with artillery fire. This battle became a classic example of a submarine duel in the confined conditions of Arctic waters, where crew training and knowledge of local conditions were crucial. Air warfare over the Arctic had its own characteristics, which radically distinguished it from air battles in other theaters of war. Extreme climatic conditions, vast distances, and the lack of landmarks made every sortie deadly dangerous, even without enemy opposition. German aviation in the Arctic was represented by the special JJG-5 Izmir Ice Sea Squadron, based at airfields in northern Norway. The squadron included Messerschmitt 109 fighters and Heinkel 111 bombers, specially adapted for Arctic conditions. Soviet aviation in the Arctic was represented by units of the Northern Fleet Air Force and the polar aviation of the Main Directorate of the Northern Sea Route. The main types of aircraft were I-16 and I-153 fighters, SB and DB-3 bombers, and Li-2 and ANT-6 transport aircraft. But could these machines operate effectively in conditions for which they were not designed? The first air battle over the Arctic took place on July 29, 1941, in the area of the Barentsburg Polar Station on Spitsbergen. A group of German bombers attacked the station, but was intercepted by Soviet Y-16 fighters under the command of Captain Boris Safonov. Safonov shot down 2 German aircraft, becoming the first Soviet ace of the Arctic skies. His air combat tactics in Arctic conditions were based on using snow clouds for camouflage and surprise attacks from under the blinding sun, reflected by the ice fields. Polar aviation played a key role in supplying remote stations and evacuating the wounded. Transport aircraft pilots flew in conditions where visibility did not exceed a few meters, and temperatures dropped to -50 degrees. Every landing on an ice floe was a feat. Polar aviation pilot Mikhail Vodopyanov distinguished himself in particular, making 170 flights to supply polar stations in 1942. His Li-2 Joseph Stalin aircraft became a legend in the Arctic. How can the value of his flights be measured by the amount of cargo delivered, when each flight saved human lives? Vodopyanov developed a unique method for landing on unprepared ice surfaces. He studied the structure of the ice from the air, identified safe places to land, and used natural landmarks for navigation in polar night conditions. Many of his techniques were included in polar aviation textbooks. German pilots tried to disrupt air supplies to polar stations by intercepting transport planes en route. In October 1942, there was an air battle between a Li-2 transport plane piloted by Vodopyanov and a pair of German fighters. Despite the fact that the Li-2 was a slow and poorly armed aircraft, Vodopyanov managed to escape pursuit by using his knowledge of the terrain and weather conditions. He led the German fighters into a snowstorm, where their advantage in speed and maneuverability was reduced to 0. The polar station's aviation consisted of light communication and reconnaissance aircraft, U-2, R-5, and Esh-2. These machines were used for ice reconnaissance, communication between stations, and evacuation of the sick and wounded. The pilots of these aircraft were versatile specialists: pilots, mechanics, and radio operators. Vasily Akuratov, a pilot at the Dixon Polar Station, flew reconnaissance missions over the sea in his U-2, detecting German ships and submarines. His reports helped sink 3 German submarines. When his plane was shot down by an enemy fighter, Akuratov made an emergency landing and walked across the ice for 3 days to the nearest station. Can we call the daily work of people for whom mortal danger was a common occurrence heroic? Polar aviation pilots risked their lives every day, performing seemingly routine tasks to ensure the operation of Arctic stations. Medical aviation played a special role. In the Arctic, the rapid evacuation of the sick and wounded was often a matter of life and death. Medical aviation pilots landed on any available surface: icy fields, tundra lakes, and snow-covered airfields at polar stations. Military pilot Anatoly Lyapodevsky, known for rescuing the Chelyuskinites, commanded an aviation group during the war that provided communication with drifting polar stations. His planes delivered not only food and equipment to the ice floes, but also military specialists, In the winter of 1942 to 1943, the German Air Force launched a series of massive raids on polar airfields. The goal was to paralyze air traffic between polar stations and deprive them of the ability to receive supplies and reinforcements. The raid on the Dixon airfield on January 12, 1943, was repelled by anti-aircraft artillery and fighter planes. The Germans lost 4 bombers, but managed to damage the runway and destroy 2 transport planes. It took 2 weeks to repair the airfield. Pilots and technicians worked in a blizzard at -40 degrees, clearing the runway and repairing damaged aircraft. Wasn't this a manifestation of the same heroism as air battles with the enemy? Partisan warfare in the Arctic took on completely unique forms, unparalleled in world history. Classic methods of guerrilla warfare had to be adapted to extreme conditions, where every operation involved the risk not only of being killed by the enemy, but also of dying from the cold. The initiator of the creation of Arctic partisan detachments was the commander of the Northern Fleet, Admiral Arseny Golovko. In the fall of 1941, he signed an order to form special groups for operations behind enemy lines on the Arctic islands and coast. The guerrilla units were based on experienced polar explorers, hunters, and reindeer herders, people for whom the Arctic was their home. They were joined by military specialists, demolition experts, radio operators, and scouts. But who could have imagined that knowledge of polar bear habits would prove more important than military training? The first Arctic partisan unit was formed on Novaya Zemlya under the leadership of commercial hunter Ilya Konstantinov. The unit consisted of 12 people, including 2 female radio operators. The unit's base was an abandoned polar station deep in the interior of the island. The tactics of the Arctic partisans differed radically from those of their forest counterparts. Their main weapons were not automatic rifles, but skis, sleds, and dog teams. Speed of movement on snow and ice, knowledge of hiding places, and the ability to survive in extreme conditions were what determined the success of their operations. Konstantinov developed a unique system of hiding places for weapons and food. The storages were located in natural shelters, caves, rock crevices, and abandoned buildings. Each hiding place was designed to support the group's autonomous activities for a month. Konstantinov's unit carried out its first operation in November 1941. The target was a German weather station set up by the occupiers on Cape Zelania. A group of 6 partisans traveled more than 100 kilometers across the ice and launched a surprise attack on the station at dawn. The German garrison at the weather station consisted of 8 men. They did not expect an attack in such conditions and were completely demoralized by the surprise attack. Within 20 minutes of fighting, the station was captured and its equipment destroyed. Could the Germans have imagined that guerrilla warfare was possible in the Arctic? The partisans' actions against German submarine supply bases were particularly effective. These bases were located on remote islands and were considered completely safe. But the Arctic partisans managed to discover and destroy several such facilities. The base on Alexandra Land was destroyed by a group of partisans led by former polar explorer Nikolai Urvantsev, namesake of the famous geologist. The partisans approached the base on the ice, using snowstorms for camouflage, and blew up the fuel depots. The explosion was so powerful that it was heard 50 kilometers away. Women played an important role in the Arctic partisan detachments. Radio operator Maria Oktyabrskaya, not the tank driver, but her namesake, provided communication between the detachments, transmitting intelligence and coordinating operations. Her radio station operated from a shelter in an ice cave 20 meters deep. Oktyabrskaya developed a coding system based on polar hunting terms. A polar bear meant a German ship, a walrus meant a submarine, and a seal meant an airplane. These codes seemed natural in Arctic conditions and did not arouse suspicion when intercepted. Isn't it amazing that hunting jargon became the language of military intelligence? The partisans used every feature of Arctic life to fight the enemy, turning their life experience into a military advantage. Supplies were delivered to partisan units by submarines and aircraft. Cargo was dropped by parachute at pre-arranged locations or delivered by submarines to secret bases on the coast. Each such operation was extremely risky. The evacuation of wounded partisans was particularly difficult. In the Arctic, any injury could be fatal due to the inability to provide qualified medical care. Many partisans died not from enemy bullets, but from frostbite and infections. Anna Shetinina, a nurse in a partisan unit, saved the lives of dozens of comrades by performing complex operations in field conditions at temperatures of -40 degrees. Her improvised hospital in an abandoned polar station became a medical center for all units in the region. In the winter of 1942 to 1943, partisan units carried out Operation White Death against German communications in the Arctic. 7 enemy targets on different islands were attacked simultaneously. The operation was coordinated by radio under the strictest secrecy. The operation was a complete success. 2 submarine supply bases, a weather station, a radio beacon, and an aviation fuel depot were destroyed. German losses amounted to 40 killed and wounded, while the partisans lost only 3 fighters. Isn't it symbolic that the operation was named White Death? Death coming from the Arctic snows? For the German occupiers, the Arctic really became a source of constant threat, from where death could come at any moment. The successes of the Arctic partisans forced the German command to allocate significant forces to fight them. Special punitive detachments were created, equipped with Arctic gear and trained to operate in polar conditions. But even these measures could not completely suppress the partisan movement in the Arctic. Allied convoys traveling along the northern route to Soviet ports became one of the most important factors in winning the war. Meteorological data transmitted from Soviet polar stations was critical to the safety of these convoys. But could the polar explorers have imagined that their weather reports would save thousands of lives on Allied ships? The first Allied convoy, PQ-1, sailed the Arctic route in September 1941. It consisted of 10 transport ships carrying military supplies. To guide the convoy, the British Admiralty requested detailed weather reports for the entire route from the Soviet side. The Soviet Union's polar stations were tasked with providing the convoys with special weather forecasts every 3 hours. This required the coordination of the entire Arctic network of stations and the creation of a single center for processing meteorological information. The center was established at the Dixon Polar Station under the leadership of experienced meteorologist Mikhail Somov. Not the future director of the Arctic Institute, but his namesake. The center had access to data from 30 polar stations and drifting buoys. Storm and ice forecasts were particularly important. The ships in the convoys were not ice-strengthened and could suffer serious damage if they encountered heavy ice. An error in the forecast could cost the crews their lives and result in the loss of valuable cargo. Convoy PQ-8, sailing in January 1942, encountered a severe storm off the coast of Novaya Zemlya. Thanks to the accurate forecast by Soviet meteorologists, the convoy ships were able to take shelter in Belushia Guba Bay and wait out the storm without loss. Can the value of these forecasts be measured by the number of ships saved? Each accurate forecast meant the preservation of sailors' lives, the delivery of weapons and food, and the approach of victory over fascism. German aircraft and submarines actively hunted Allied convoys. Meteorological data allowed routes to be planned, avoiding areas with poor visibility where convoys became easy prey for the enemy. The tragedy of convoy PQ-17 in July 1942 demonstrated the importance of accurate weather forecasts. Due to an erroneous order to disperse the convoy in poor visibility conditions, the ships lost mutual support and were destroyed one by one. The polar station at Cape Desire transmitted accurate data on weather conditions in the area where the convoy was lost, but this information was not communicated to the command in a timely manner. Of the 35 transports in the convoy, only 11 survived. After the PQ-17 tragedy, the convoy weather support system was radically revised. Direct communication channels were established between polar stations and escort force headquarters. All important forecasts were duplicated, and meteorologists were put on round-the-clock duty. Drifting weather stations played a special role, transmitting data directly from the convoy routes. The SP-2 station, led by Mikhail Somov, drifted in the central part of the Arctic Ocean and transmitted unique information about the weather in the area. Can you imagine the courage of the people who lived on a drifting ice floe for months, knowing that it could break apart at any moment? But it was their data that allowed the convoys to choose the best routes and avoid the most dangerous areas. Radio communication with the drifting stations was maintained through a network of repeaters at coastal stations. A complex coding system protected the information from being intercepted by the enemy. The Germans repeatedly tried to jam the radio stations of the drifting stations, but without success. Convoy PQ-18 in September 1942 was the first to be fully protected by accurate weather forecasts. Thanks to data from Soviet polar stations, the convoy was able to avoid encountering large German air forces and safely reach Arkhangelsk. Winter convoys required particularly accurate forecasts due to extreme weather conditions. The air temperature dropped to -40 degrees. The ships were covered with ice, and visibility did not exceed a few meters. In such conditions, any error in the forecast could be fatal. In December 1942, convoy JW-51B encountered a violent storm in the Bear Islands area. Accurate forecasts by Soviet meteorologists allowed the escort ships to take all necessary measures to protect the transports. All ships in the convoy reached Murmansk safely. Isn't it surprising that reports on temperature and wind became more important than military orders? In Arctic conditions, nature was a more dangerous enemy than enemy aircraft and submarines. By the end of the war, the weather support system for Allied convoys had reached perfection. Polar stations transmitted forecasts every hour. Drifting stations provided data from routes, and aircraft conducted ice reconnaissance. Convoy losses from storms and ice were minimized. Survival in Arctic conditions during wartime required not only courage, but also constant technical innovation. Polar stations became veritable laboratories where new methods of combating the cold, ways of preserving equipment, and emergency life support systems were developed. The main problem was protection from the cold. At temperatures below -40 degrees, ordinary military equipment proved ineffective. Polar explorers developed a multi-layered clothing system using traditional materials from the indigenous peoples of the North. Deerskin proved to be particularly valuable as it did not freeze even in extreme temperatures and retained its heat-protective properties after getting wet. Polar explorers exchanged food for skins and finished products from local reindeer herders. Vasily Voronin, an engineer at the Dixon Polar Station, created a unique heating system using exhaust gases from diesel generators. Hot gases were passed through a system of pipes under the floors of buildings, creating efficient and economical heating. Wasn't it ingenious to turn waste into a source of life? This system reduced fuel consumption by 30%, which, in conditions of disrupted supplies, meant the difference between life and death. Keeping the equipment in working order was a particular challenge. Radio equipment was damaged by condensation, mechanisms seized up due to thickened lubricants, and batteries lost their capacity. Polar explorers developed many techniques to protect their equipment. Radio engineer Mikhail Kremlev invented a system for heating radio tubes using kerosene burners. The tubes were placed in special casings with reflectors that ensured uniform heating. This system made it possible to maintain radio communication even at temperatures of -50 degrees. Lubricants were replaced with homemade compounds based on fish oil and reindeer fat. These biological lubricants did not thicken in the cold and ensured reliable operation of the mechanisms. The recipes for such lubricants were passed from station to station as a military secret. The problem of power supply was solved with the help of hand-operated generators and wind engines of their own manufacture. Polar explorers learned to make wind generators from materials at hand: metal sheets, wooden bars, and car generators. Can something born out of desperation be called an invention? Every technical solution was a matter of survival, and polar explorers showed remarkable ingenuity in creating viable equipment from scrap metal. The problem of water supply was particularly acute. Melting snow required a lot of fuel, and drilling wells in the ice was extremely laborious. Polar explorers developed a system for collecting and purifying condensate from human breath and working mechanisms. Anna Menina, a doctor at the Tikaya Bay Polar Station, created a unique method of treating frostbite using local plants. She used decoctions of polar willow and moss for compresses, which significantly accelerated the healing of frostbitten tissues. The polar explorer's diet required a special approach. In extreme cold, the body needed a high-calorie diet. Polar explorers learned to cook high-calorie meals from a minimal set of ingredients. Pyotr Kuznetsov, a cook at the Cape Desire Polar Station, invented a way to make polar bread from a mixture of flour, fat, and dried meat. This bread retained its nutritional properties at any temperature and could be eaten without additional processing. Vitamin-enriched foods were particularly valuable for the prevention of scurvy. Polar explorers learned how to extract vitamin C from dwarf spruce needles, harvest cloudberries and lingonberries for the winter, and store them in natural refrigerators. Communication between remote stations was maintained using signal fires and flares. A code system was developed that allowed simple messages to be transmitted over distances of up to 15 kilometers in clear weather. Transportation problems were solved with the help of dog sleds and ski patrols. Polar explorers developed new types of sleds adapted for transporting heavy loads over rough terrain. The sleds were designed to be collapsible for ease of transport. Isn't it symbolic that in the age of motors and radio, survival depended on dogs and skis? The Arctic forced a return to centuries-old methods of transportation, which proved to be more reliable than modern technology. Ivan Nenyang, a Kayur at the Kolguyev Polar Station, bred a special breed of sled dogs adapted to working in extreme conditions. These dogs could work at temperatures as low as -60 degrees and cover distances of up to 100 kilometers a day. The emergency shelter system included a network of intermediate bases with food and fuel supplies. Shelters were built every 20 to 30 kilometers along the main routes and could ensure the survival of a group of people for a week. Women polar explorers played a special role in the Arctic War, which for a long time remained in the shadow of men's exploits. They were radio operators and nurses, meteorologists and cooks. But above all, they were the guardians of humanity in the inhuman conditions of war. Before the war, women made up about 20% of the staff at polar stations. With the outbreak of war, many men were mobilized or transferred to purely military positions, and the proportion of women in polar teams increased significantly. The first woman to die in the Arctic War was Anna Petrova, a radio operator at the polar station on Dixon Island. When German saboteurs attacked the station, she transmitted a distress signal until the very last minute. Her body was found at the destroyed radio station with a key in her hands. How can one measure the value of the last radio message sent by a woman who knew she was dying? Her message allowed the Soviet command to learn about the German landing and organize the defense of other stations. Radio operator Zinaida Martinova worked at the drifting station SP-4, which in 1943 fell into the zone of German submarines. When the station came under fire, Martinova continued to transmit weather reports from the half-destroyed radio room. The ice beneath the station began to break apart from the explosions, but Martinova did not leave her post. She transmitted the coordinates of the German submarines until the ice floe finally broke apart. She was rescued 5 hours later, when she was already in the water wearing a life jacket. Nurse Maria Kaplan served at the Dixon Polar Station during the heroic defense of the island. She helped the wounded under fire, carried them to safe places, and performed operations in basements by the light of kerosene lamps. During the second attack on Dixon, Kaplan saved the lives of 13 wounded soldiers by organizing their evacuation to a submarine. She herself suffered a shrapnel wound to the head, but continued to work until reinforcements arrived. Was this not a manifestation of maternal love for her comrades in arms? Ekaterina Savitskaya, the cook at the Cape Chelyuskin Polar Station, fed the station staff for 7 months during the blockade. When the main food supplies ran out, she learned to cook edible dishes from seaweed, moss, and the roots of polar plants. Savitskaya kept precise records of every gram of food, providing all members of the team with the minimum necessary nutrition. Her culinary improvisations saved 12 people from starvation. After the war, her recipes for blockade cuisine were studied in polar medicine institutes. Meteorologist Valentina Serova worked at the northernmost polar station of the USSR, Cape Arcticeski, on Franz Josef Land. In the conditions of the polar night, she single-handedly conducted all meteorological observations when her male colleagues were evacuated due to injury. For 4 months, Serova worked alone, going out every 3 hours to check the instruments at a temperature of -50 degrees. Her reports were critical for Soviet aviation flights over the North Pole. Can you imagine the strength of spirit of a woman who did not see other people for months? Radio operator Antonina Palshina provided communication between partisan units on Novaya Zemlya. Her radio station operated from an underground bunker built into the rocks. Palshina developed a coding system based on women's names, which the enemy was unable to decipher for a long time. When the Germans detected the location of her radio station, Palshina blew up the bunker along with the equipment. but managed to escape herself. A week later, she re-established communication with a new radio station built in another shelter. Polar aviation pilot Polina Osipenko, not the famous record holder, but her namesake, made supply flights to besieged polar stations. In her light U-2 aircraft, she flew more than 50,000 kilometers over the Arctic, delivering medicines and mail. Osipenko was shot down by a German fighter over the Kara Sea, but managed to land the damaged plane on the ice. She walked across the ice for 3 days to the nearest polar station, navigating by the stars. Frostbite cost her 2 toes, but she returned to flying. Isn't it symbolic that women preserved human warmth in the coldest place on the planet? They not only performed their professional duties, but also supported the morale of their teams, creating a home-away-from-home atmosphere. Dr. Nadezhda Kuznetsova worked at several polar stations, moving to where she was most needed. She performed more than 100 operations in the field, saved dozens of lives, and taught the basics of medicine to many polar explorers. Kuznetsova developed methods for treating specific polar diseases: snow blindness, polar depression, and frostbite. Her medical recommendations were used at all Arctic stations. After the war, she authored the first textbook on polar medicine. Translator Elena Ritku, a native of Chukotka, served as a liaison between polar stations and local residents. Her knowledge of local languages and traditions helped organize the supply of local hunting and reindeer herding products to the stations. Many female polar explorers were awarded orders and medals, but most of their exploits remained unknown to the general public. Only the archives preserve the sparse lines of award lists, behind which lie human destinies and incredible courage. By the beginning of 1944, the war in the Arctic had entered its final phase. German forces were exhausted by continuous fighting on the main fronts, and their activity in Arctic waters had significantly decreased. But the polar stations continued to stand guard until the very end of the war. Operation Human was the German Navy's last major attempt to disrupt Soviet Arctic communications. In March 1944, a group of German destroyers attempted to break through to Dixon Island and destroy the radio center. By that time, the Dixon Polar Station had become a veritable fortress. Powerful coastal batteries, anti-aircraft guns, and underground bunkers made the island impregnable to any naval assault. But was the strength of the fortifications the defenders' main weapon? Operation Human began on the night of March 21st. 3 German destroyers approached the island from the north under cover of fog and opened artillery fire. But the defenders were ready for such a turn of events. The coastal batteries returned fire from the very first shots of the enemy. Artillery Commander Major Vasily Babushkin, brother of the hero of the first defense of Dixon, personally aimed the guns at the targets. The second German destroyer was hit directly and caught fire. The island's anti-aircraft artillery repelled an attempt by German aircraft to strike the radio center. I-16 fighters under the command of Captain Alexei Orlov attacked the bombers as they approached the island. 3 German aircraft were shot down. An attempt to land saboteurs from a submarine also failed. Coastal patrols spotted the rubber boats still at sea, and the saboteurs came under fire from machine gun posts directly on the shore. Operation Human ended in complete failure. After the March battles, the Germans made no further serious attempts to attack Soviet polar stations. Wehrmacht forces were needed on other fronts, where the fate of the war was being decided. The Arctic gradually transformed from a theater of war into a rear area. But did that mean the war in the Arctic was over? Polar explorers continued to serve in combat, transmit weather reports, and guide Allied convoys. Their work was still important for the overall victory. The last German aircraft was shot down over an Arctic station on April 23, 1945. A Messerschmitt 109 attempted to attack a polar station on Wehrmacht Island, but was intercepted by Lieutenant Petrov's Soviet Van-16 fighter. On May 9, 1945, the polar stations of the Soviet Arctic received news of Germany's surrender. The war was over, but the polar explorers remained at their posts. Peaceful weather reports now helped to restore the destroyed economy. Many defenders of the Arctic stations were awarded orders and medals. Dixon Island received the honorary title of Island of Military Glory, and its defenders were awarded the title of Heroes of the Soviet Union. But the main reward was victory itself. Wasn't it symbolic that the war ended in the same place where peaceful science had once begun? The polar stations returned to their original purpose, studying the Arctic and ensuring the safety of navigation. The last wartime radiogram was transmitted from Dixon Island on May 10, 1945, at midnight Moscow time. The war is over. We are resuming scientific observations. Dixon's simple words that represented 4 years of heroic struggle. It took several months to clear the rubble and restore the destroyed equipment. Many stations had to be rebuilt, but most importantly, the people survived, retained their professionalism, and remained true to their cause. The experience of the war years was not wasted. The technical solutions found by the polar explorers were used in the creation of new stations. Methods of survival in extreme conditions became part of the training of polar personnel. The legacy of the Arctic War of 1941 to 1945 turned out to be much more significant than its participants could have imagined. The experience gained by polar explorers during the war years determined the development of Arctic research for decades to come and laid the foundations for the modern system of polar stations. Human losses in the Arctic War were relatively small compared to the main fronts. About 300 polar explorers died, but each death was an irreplaceable loss of top-class professionals. How can one measure the loss of people for whom the Arctic was not just a place of work, but the meaning of life? Many veterans of the Arctic War continued to work in the polar regions after the victory. Their experience of survival in extreme conditions, knowledge of Arctic technology, and skills in organizing autonomous work became an invaluable asset to Soviet polar science. Nikolai Kornyakov, head of the Dixon Station during the heroic defense, led the creation of a new network of Arctic stations in the post-war years. His principles of organizing polar teams, based on military experience, were used in training personnel for the exploration of Antarctica. The system of coding meteorological information, developed during the war, became the basis for international standards for the transmission of weather data. Soviet codes proved to be so reliable that they were adopted by many countries around the world as a model. Technical innovations from wartime found application in peaceful polar technology. Emergency heating systems, methods of protecting equipment from the cold, and the design of polar dwellings were all developed and improved in the post-war period. Can it be considered a coincidence that the Soviet Union became the world leader in the exploration of the Arctic and Antarctic? The training that polar explorers underwent during the war years provided the country with unique personnel and technologies for conquering the polar regions of the planet. The drifting polar stations North Pole, which began operating before the war, became a permanent research system in the Central Arctic in the post-war period. The experience of autonomous operation in military conditions helped to create stations capable of drifting for years. The polar station aviation, which had undergone rigorous military training, became the basis for the creation of a system of regular air service to the Arctic regions. The methods of landing on unprepared ice airfields, developed by military pilots, are still in use today. Women polar explorers, who proved their ability to work in the harshest conditions during the war, became equal participants in Arctic expeditions. Many of them headed polar stations, became prominent scientists, and made outstanding contributions to the study of the Arctic. The international significance of the experience of Soviet polar explorers was recognized in the early post-war years. Specialists from many countries came to the USSR to study methods of working in polar conditions. Soviet polar explorers participated in the creation of stations in Antarctica. The radio communication system created for the needs of the Arctic War became the prototype for modern polar communication systems. The principles of channel duplication, the use of different frequencies, and information encoding were developed in peacetime as well. Isn't it amazing that military necessity gave rise to technologies that still serve peaceful science today? Many solutions found under the pressure of the military situation proved so effective that they became standard for polar technology. The memory of the Arctic War is preserved in the names of stations, bays, and capes. Icebreakers and research vessels bear the names of polar heroes. Their experiences are studied in institutes and schools that train specialists to work in polar regions. Modern Russian polar stations continue the traditions established during the war years. The principles of independence, preparedness for extreme situations, and comradely mutual assistance remain the foundation of polar service. The Arctic War of 1941 to 1945 showed that true victory is achieved not only on the battlefield, but also in laboratories, at polar stations, and in meteorologists' radio rooms. The feat of the polar explorers became part of the great victory, and this part was no less important than the heroism of the soldiers at the front. Today, when the Arctic is once again becoming an object of geopolitical interest, the experience of military polar explorers is particularly relevant. Their example shows that the real strength of a country in the Arctic lies not in the number of military bases, but in the people who are willing to live and work in this harsh region.